Hi, everybody. I'm glad it looks like we still have energy at 3 o'clock, so they're 3:30. So I'm glad everyone got some caffeine. Feel good about it? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I don't think that this is going to be, as many people before me have said, anything revolutionary or things that you don't already know, but I'm hoping it'll be some food for thought. We've been through a lot in the past 2.5 years with the pandemic, and I feel like what's tied into the creativity session that we had earlier and a lot of the other things that have been said, we've had to think about, areas and functions like customer success a little bit differently. And in that time, I also switched from a typical subscription SaaS company over to Stripe, which clearly operates a little bit differently and has also helped me kind of see that there's different measures and different ways that we should be considering for customer success. The CS function at Stripe is actually just over a year old, so relatively new. So we're really in that build phase, and I've tried to take a lot of what I learned from your typical customer success subscription-based practices and apply them here. So hoping to go through some of that today. So here's the agenda of what I'm going to run through. I'll start with a bit about me and why I'm passionate about this topic. I feel like it's important to understand kind of the motivation behind the people that are talking to you, why they care, how they came up with this. Some key takeaways. I feel like repetition is the key, which we've heard in some of the sessions to date, but I will repeat myself a couple of times. I promise it's for good reason. And kind of the evolution that I've seen at a glance and different considerations along that journey. And then I'll kind of take us through a closing. So a bit about me, why I picked this topic. So as I said, I'm Megan. I run our global customer success strategy and operations team at Stripe. So I am actually not customer facing. I work on the strategies and the tooling and the operations and the processes that help those folks be successful. I am a big fan of being embedded in the business. And I think part of the reason I've always been driven to customer success is I think of myself almost as that customer success person for my business partners. And so I've really applied that and why I decided to pick this topic today. So as I mentioned, before Stripe, I was at a subscription SaaS company, and I was there for quite a while. I saw the journey from being really reactive, where we had like churn save teams in place and, looking at adoption measures, but, much later in our journey. And as we heard from some of the onboarding speaking today, that's really too late to be kind of intervening and helping with your users and your customers. So I went through that journey. We started to do proactive health measurement, and you can get stuck in a lot of complexity there. So we learned a lot through that journey and just making sure that we were trying to simplify as much as possible. We started to also discuss different predictive measures. And as we've heard from a lot of folks today, that AI component of making sure that you're kind of getting ahead of the game and you're getting smarter about your health measures has become really important. And the thing I've learned across all of this, and this has been reiterated in most of the sessions I've listened to today, is putting the customer at the center of whatever you're doing, whatever you're iterating on, whatever you're thinking about, I think ends up with the best result for both the company that you work for and those customers, which as a customer success organization is really what we're focused on. So, wrong green button. With that, here are some key takeaways that we're going to go through in more detail, but like I said, repetition will be the key. So I'm hoping when you walk away from this session, here are some things that you start to consider in your own businesses as an impact of everything we've been through in the last 2.5 years, and as I said, some personal experience as I've shifted into this more consumption-based model at Stripe. So this move to virtual over the past couple of years, I think that companies have done incredible things kind of iterating and figuring out how to operate in this digital world. I think one downside of it has been there's been a lot of noise in your digital space, right? You get so many emails or engagement, and this was spoken about earlier as well. How do you narrow down on the things that are actually valuable for the customer that you're working with, and figure out how to build the right relationships across your entire stack of engagement? One big thing that came to us is, at Stripe, we have a huge focus on that, one-to-one or like really white glove CSM experience. You were able to actually go to a customer, build rapport, learn what's important to them. I mean, I remember even back when I first started, and I started as the finance partner actually to a CS organization, and my boss at the time was like, go sit down with the chief customer officer, figure out what's important to him. That's how you'll help him build a strategy. And I was like, just sit down with him and ask him what's important to him? She was like, absolutely, it will make all the difference. I mean, today, such a good friend of mine, mentor, have him on speed dial. So I feel like those things are so critical. But in a digital age, like, how do you do that? And how do you figure out like what is important for your users to build those types of relationships? It's really challenging. And I think it's really custom to what your business stands for, what your customers' values stand for, and really figuring that out, but just considerations as we've moved into this digital space. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think there's also been a lot of like over pivot to the digital kind of funnel of information that we should be mindful of. The next thing, as I moved into more consumption-based, it's been really interesting to see that normal health measures, measuring retention, lagging indicators, building up all those phases. I mean, when a customer in fintech is not happy with you, you will know the next day. It's a very immediate response from your users. They're like, cool, your margin doesn't work for me, your product doesn't work for me. They're just going to process less on you and they're going to take it to somebody else. And there's not a whole lot of cost involved in that switching. And so I think that has helped us be smarter and also be more transparent with our customers. When we think about how do you build success metrics, they should be shared with your user. Those things that you're holding yourself accountable for should be shared, and you should build them in a way that allows both of you to kind of comment and basically evolve with that. So that's been like one big learning coming into fintech. And so the current evolution of the space accounts for both the evolving models, so like I said, moving and kind of incorporating that consumption base. Even if you're not in consumption, I think that those learnings are really critical. And also the shifting macro trend of, the overall climate that we've been living in for the past couple of years, and just being mindful of like the things that really made a difference before COVID and before we were all at home, and how did you build those relationships and how could you translate that? Just as a small aside, I used to run a pretty large team when we started the pandemic, and when we were going through that shift, one thing I noticed is there was such a value in that immediate feedback loop too. When you were exiting a conference room, you were having that quick debrief. That just stopped existing when we like exited and went to the next Zoom, and I feel like there was so much lost and so much learning lost there. So those kind of moments that you can capture, but like capture it in a virtual world without losing that authenticity and that engagement with your customers can be so, so critical. Cool. So two kind of pieces to this. I'm a visual human, so that was my wordy slide. This is my just picture slide. On what will be your right-hand side is kind of how I think about the engagement model for customer success. So a lot of, we've heard today around like the one-to-many approach. I kind of think of that as like the CS scale approach. And I don't actually think it needs to just apply to a certain set of users. But I think in this virtual world, what you can think about is it can lift up a lot of your, again, white glove CSMs in your high-touch CSM model in the same way that the things you're learning and the things you're doing in your high-touch CSM model can actually impact that one-to-many approach. I mean, we've piloted and I've heard about folks that are really trialing this like in the middle of that, where you've got a perfect balance between high-touch and you may be using some tooling or some different automations where to be able to manage that one-to-many, if you're in a multi-product space, you're coming in and actually saying, okay, for the next 2 quarters, the thing we really care about is product A. We need to drive adoption around that product. We need to drive better engagement around that product. And that's what we're going to be focused on as a team. So these are the assignments accordingly. This is how we're switching up our territories. This is our whole engagement plan. And so you have this perfect merriment where you've got the right tooling, you've got clear focus, and you can take those high-touch resources and actually apply them in a way that can work in that one-to-many space. So again, I just like to think about it more as a continuum where each is learning from each other, and it's not like a perfect pyramid, which is kind of how I started looking at it when I started in CS. And then the thing I would pair with that, and again, with customer centricity kind of at the center of this, is thinking about, most of us started with a very reactive approach to CS. You start in a world where you are just trying to stay on top of those incoming asks. In some cases, if you've pivoted, you might just be an escalation path for support, right? How do you get out of that space? How do you become more proactive? What are the right tools? What are the right processes? What are the right communications to get there? And then how do you begin to incorporate more predictive elements? But I think it's a very iterative process as you begin to build and as you continue to kind of evolve your strategy. You have times where you're going to go back to a very reactive state, right? The world is changing, things are evolving. And I think you can't be afraid to just dive back in and say, what have we learned in this revolution? How do we now begin the next one? So these are kind of the ways I think about that model that I just described. Cool. So like I said, it all began a little reactive. When I first started looking at the CS team and the way that we were engaging with customers, this is kind of how I would think about our current customer methodology at Stripe. And when I was in the SaaS space, we really only looked at risk mitigation and risk mitigation data. So we had a lot of great data on why customers were leaving, and we had a lot of great data where we thought there were risks in our customer base. We weren't really looking at early on what was happening with those customers, and I don't think we did a really effective job at even taking that churn data and going back to the beginning and saying, what could we have done differently with these users? And I think many of you in different stages of your current company and the way you're building out CS teams have probably had something similar happen. And so we kind of took a step back and we were like, this problem isn't getting better. Like, our reactions to this isn't making it better. So how do we think about this potentially a little differently? We thought about isolating teams so that there was just a reactive team. That's all they did. And then we could pull the resources off to start building a more proactive approach, which can be one way that you go to solve this. We thought about also having, different cohorts of customers that were all along, or CSMs that were all along the customer journey. So you've got people that are focused on the onboarding problem, or lack thereof, hopefully, that you have. You've got people focused on kind of that building relationship, and then you've got people focused on this renewal or risk mitigation. And we tested that, and I highly recommend this in your space. Like, pilots and tests in certain populations, I think will tell you, and I think we heard earlier, like A/B tests, such a great way to see what will work for your customer base, and just being mindful if you've got an overarching methodology or you've got a North Star of where you're going with your team, this is a good way to test, is this right for my business, versus somebody else just telling you, well, this worked really well for my business, which may not be the right fit for you. So with that, did I overdo it? I potentially overdid it. Okay. No. This one's on the right one, and this one's ahead. Nope. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Technology, clearly not my strong suit. So eventually we evolved to this more proactive approach, and it honestly was a combination of all of those things I just described. We tried out a pilot where, some of these CSMs only had net retention targets for their portfolio. So we had them tasked with managing the whole account, the upsells on the account, engaging with their sales counterparts. Also a great way to drive partnership between sales and CS. Have them share a number. It's a great way to get people to work together. We tried having, an at-scale team that actually looked at both the onboarding all the way through to renewal motion, which I think really helped and informed. We learned a ton while we were doing that. And we looked at adoption and realized this isn't really enough to tell us if a user is healthy or not. So instead, we looked across stronger account foundations. So are you meeting with your customer regularly? What are those right key activities, which I think we saw in an earlier presentation in that phase one? What are those right key activities to measure? Are those correlated to the outcomes you're looking to drive to with your business? We also looked at customer engagement. How engaged are your customers? We talked a little bit about advocacy in the last session. At Stripe, we look at, how engaged are your exec sponsors? So again, back to your customer as a human, right? It's not just about what your relationship is with that customer overall. What is your relationship with multiple stakeholders at that customer to make sure that, if one were to change roles or change jobs or you get a shakeup, you still have strong relationships throughout the organization that really help you drive and continue to drive deep adoption in that account. And then, of course, at the core of it, there's still a piece about driving adoption. And like I said, when it comes to consumption-based, that's pretty immediate, whether you're being successful or not. So I'm calling it a leading indicator, but potentially that's being too generous on how much time that gives you to change things up. And then, of course, we kept in place the measuring of retention. So if you look at this whole methodology, you still want to make sure you've got those lagging outcome indicators. And I think the important piece, too, is to ensure over time, and this is where a bit of the predictive comes in, that you're actually looking at what the tie between those two is. Are your leading indicators actually indicating that your lagging indicators are going to do better? Because you'd be amazed, sometimes you get it wrong. I mean, most often you get it wrong. I mean, a lot of my career was in financial planning, and some of it is just good guesses, right? It's assumptions that you put in place and you test and you kind of iterate going over time. So I think, again, putting the customer at the center of it, making sure that you're driving the right outcomes for them and a full cycle of kind of that customer journey within your your own organization can really help you figure out what the right model is. And at the end, ask yourself, are you seeing around corners for your customers, leveraging this framework, this tooling, this methodology, this way of working? And what outcomes are you driving from it, and what outcomes are your customers driving from it? And I think thinking about things in that lens where you're, reconsidering things that worked before this and maybe worked at the beginning of the pandemic, but are no longer as applicable to your customer base after people have the fatigue of the overwhelming amount of digitalization that's happened, I think will help people drive better outcomes overall. So, when you think about this coverage model, we spoke a little bit about that macro trend of digitalization, and we talked about kind of the way I think about coverage and kind of the one-to-many or the at-scale versus your high versus your self-service. I think here are some considerations when you're thinking about your current segmentation, whatever that might look like, and how you might see benefits in your customer base given the opportunity that we've had around digitalization. So I think one thing around the high and medium touch is just get creative on what your customer relationships look like. I've had CSMs tell me, and I've been lucky enough to shadow quite a few calls as we've gone through this transition, and people get really creative about ways they introduce themselves to new point of contacts at their customers. When they're transitioning an account or their customers going through something really tough, and they can tell that, again, our business is their money, and so they're really like deeply tied into us being successful so they can be successful and vice versa. And so I think when you show that interest in their business and helping them drive up their business, it can build such a strong and long-lasting relationship. And I think that, leveraging some of these different engagement models can really help when you're thinking through, new ways to be creative. One other idea that we considered, and I've heard quite a few people talk about, is actually pairing people up where you've got more of like this analyst model with your high-touch CSMs. And so the analysts, it's a great learning ground for folks that are being kind of coming up throughout your coverage model. And B, it really helps them also get more leverage when they're managing those relationships and thinking about things differently. And you've got kind of that pairing and good brainstorming that happens. So different benefits there as well. On the one-to-many side, like I said, so you can leverage that customer feedback pretty quickly. You're hearing it in these different setups on the at-scale side. I think the other piece on the one-to-many side is, like I mentioned, if you can get really focused and creative around what that one-to-many actually looks like. Is it a product that you care about driving? Is it a specific use case that you care about doubling down on? And you're looking for specific outcomes from that. I think that the work from anywhere provides some access that you probably didn't have before this all happened when you're implementing this. And I think the other piece is that creativity allows you to think about potentially those problems a little bit differently and learn a lot more from your customer base. And then the last piece around self-service is, this is one where I really think that digital has really impacted it the most. That self-service engine needs to just keep learning, because you have a lot of things where the existing programming that you just amped up to make sure there were more emails about more things your product could do in the customer's inbox, they got fatigue from that, and it's harder and harder to re-engage them. So I think thinking about decreasing potential broader digital communications and being more focused. And maybe it's taking what you've learned from your one-to-many or at-scale approaches and applying that to the way that you message to customer cohorts. Do you have certain cohorts in retail that actually would receive a message X much better? Could you tailor that and look at either the vertical or that different cohort and engage them differently? I remember when we were in our SaaS model, a lot of our age cohorts performed quite differently, right? Like whenever they bought into the company, a lot of times that was kind of the impression that stuck with them. And so we struggled a ton to evolve their understanding of the product. We went from single product to multi-product, and bringing them along that journey when they had bought us for just that single product item was so challenging. And it didn't help us when we were just messaging them, hey, we got this other product, and now we have this other product, because they were like, but how does that incorporate into the way we bought you and how we would use you? And so I think tailoring that messaging, and not getting super custom, but tailoring that messaging to, hey, this cohort that bought in 2015 probably thinks about us in this way. And then to further segment, we think that this, vertical is looking for this type of use case. And so I think bringing them along that journey and helping understand like what are those sub cohorts and how do we actually figure out how to get that better engagement without kind of the widespread digital emails, I think will help tailor your approach and get further engagement with your customers. And so I think the other thing to just reinforce here is, if consumption has taught me nothing else, it is truly that customer success motion is directly tied to the customer success of your user, of your customer, whatever you might call it. Again, if a customer has a poor experience on Stripe, they're just going to use Stripe less, and we're immediately going to see a revenue impact from that, which makes the CSM a pretty critical piece of that revenue engine, and figuring out how to drive growth within your organization. So it's just reinforced this need for faster indicators, I guess we could call them leading indicators, more immediate indicators, and then clear actions coming out of that. So in closing, I think, again, just underscoring, considering the impact of customer centricity is kind of your North Star as you're thinking through this stuff, making sure that your customer engagement models and your strategies evolve and continue to iterate. I think it's important to just continue to revisit those. Again, you're going to end up in situations where you have to kind of rethink, was that the right thing? Or even, in this new environment, we're back to reactive. Do we need to revisit what we were doing from a proactive standpoint and actually think about it differently? This move to virtual, I think, has given us a lot of opportunities to think about the way CSMs engage differently, think about the playbooks, think about the ways that they build rapport. And I think just continuing to challenge ourselves in this virtual world to not just rely on more emails, I think is critical. I think, again, learning from consumption-based businesses that have created, customer success organizations, we've learned that we need immediate feedback. We need a lot of shared transparency with our users on what success looks like. And I think it's really challenged us to think about health scoring, to think about churn, to think about the way that we engage much faster. And it's a different sense of urgency than I think I've ever felt before. So again, just in closing, the current evolution of the space, I think, requires that we both think about the evolving models in this new world that we're living in, and also the shifting macroeconomic trends. Cool. Thank you, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's do questions. And we have one more panel session after this. You get to wrap up the day with me on that one and 3 other of my friends here. And then we also have happy hour coming up. And so don't want to get in front of that. Happy hour is sponsored by Lantern. The gentleman, the CEO, will come here for a few minutes and give us a quick blurb, and then we'll go get some drinks. But before that, let's have questions from Megan. And I think you have one here.
Hi, Jessica with Digital Zone. So we necessarily don't have this issue at our company currently, but some things that you were saying were very interesting, and I agree completely, of taking a customized approach when communicating to clients, especially when it comes to SaaS and all these new products that come out, because there's always product updates and new products and, way of the world. Whenever you look at something like that, I really want your take to say, hey, we're coming into this recession. Obviously, it is very costly to be a little more customized with your approach. That's every time that you go to email a client about some new product, you need to make some sort of customization with it. You have to take time to think and strategize on it versus, sending a blanket email is just a click of a button, from your marketing team, is just sending it out to everybody, right? Versus your CS department taking time to analyze every customer and sending it out for them. I think it's very valuable, but whenever we're approaching a recession, how do you talk to your leadership about finance and balancing that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things I would consider is some of that data I talked about, like the different cohorts or the verticals, typically can live for free, right, in your CRM. And so I think that having that kind of data at your fingertips, there's not necessarily too much customization that needs to happen as long as you've got well-documented processes and well-documented outcomes. I agree, there's always cutting costs. I think the upside, and again, this is maybe where an A/B test or some kind of pilot might be really beneficial in just showing how this would affect your company. But I think that looking at that data, having it readily available, doing some A/B tests, even doing some pilots on just slight tweaks in the messaging. We know this use case works in this way, and so we're just going to prepackage that for you, and we're going to remove the cognitive load. I think will show huge revenue benefits on the other side. So I think when you think about the cost side of it, whatever that incremental time is thinking, hopefully most of that data is readily available and the customization isn't too heavy. And you're just using those simple things like we know cohorts work or we know these products are important. Yeah. Of course.
Thanks. So you've survived the transition from SaaS to consumption.
I mean, I'm a year in, so surviving is for sure.
So yeah, I guess I have a bunch of questions around that, but just could you talk to us about that transition? What do you see as the merit? Are there things that you miss about the SaaS model? Are there things that you really appreciate? Like I've loved hearing you say that it's not quite a leading indicator. It's like an immediate indicator with usage. I imagine there's some epiphanies that have come from that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me moving into fintech, especially I moved into Stripe as we were creating this team, right? So it's like I also had the experience of starting from the ground up again. I think one of the things I realized is it's not as intuitive, the value of a customer success team. So I think what it really helped me stop and think through was, what is our value? What is our mission? How do we build metrics around that? And then how do you build the rest of this very quickly? Because I think the other thing is, again, to the timing part, you just don't have the same availability to wait until a renewal, because in some cases, that's not even an opportunity that's happening. And so I think that, I think that's the most of it. I mean, I'm happy to talk more, but when I think about it in terms of what struck me most, it was, in SaaS, I feel like it's pretty well established, especially with subscriptions, that CS is so critical. I mean, that's like the center of your CLTV. I mean, we used to talk to, when I was at my prior company, I sat on the strategic finance team. We would talk to the board all the time about the value of CS, and it was always actually a fight from the board to put more CSMs in place because they saw that value. It was a complete flip to starting from a place where you had to explain this is what a CSM team does. This is why those activities are really critical. And so it's been a great reflection back on what have you learned in subscription, what have you needed to change as you've come into the fintech space, and what have you fought to keep the same. I mean, I still believe that churn and that retention metric are the things that you need to keep as your North Stars, but how do you adjust those to actually work for a subscription or for a consumption basis when it's actually worked most in subscription? Yeah.
Just interested, you talk a lot about the immediacy of when you hear from your clients. I mean, when you work in a SaaS model, sometimes it's features, it's a product roadmap that you're talking about, but what exactly do your CSMs do? If they're telling you the next day, is it a feature that went bad, or did they roll something out and they have to roll it back? I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, great question. So in some cases, it's a feature. Those are probably less immediate. We have good relationships with most of our big customers, especially. So those we take to different product forums, and we have different, feedback loops that we're doing. I think for us, it's situations where you might have really bad fraud rates, for example, and they're seeing different fraud rates on Stripe versus somewhere else, and it's something we didn't see around the corner on, right? It's something we could have prevented, but because, the tooling wasn't in place or something was missed, or, our CSMs just weren't aware, and again, having a new team and having to build out all that tooling is quite complicated. That's where you get into those kind of more immediate responses from customers. Yeah.
Hey, you had mentioned churn and mitigating risk with the churn data. Can you unpack what you look into in regard to churn, adoption, related issues, product red flags? Just curious to see what you define as churn data.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you mean that in regards to subscription or in more of the consumption space?
Or subscription.
More subscription. Okay, yeah. Some of the things that we used to capture, we definitely had different product reasons. So while it was multi-product, there weren't 100 different products. It was, an easy set that you could say it was related to this one product. And if we had a bunch of churn related to a specific product, we would put together a product tiger team, and then we'd go and address that earlier in the cycle. We also had categories like mergers and acquisitions, so things where we didn't integrate well after a merger, where we'd flag, oh, this company has been acquired, and that's now a risk. And then once it moved into the churn stage, we'd try to figure out what about that integration kind of tripped us and created a churn. And so we'd create categories like that. And in every, just to get tactical, in every CRM opportunity that we logged that was a churn, it had to have one of those set 10 agreed upon churn reasons. And then we would tie those back to actions at the start of the customer journey and try to better that moving forward. Does that help? Cool.
Megan, a great presentation. On the self-serve part of the segmentation that you had, can you talk a little bit about where CS, or more broadly like CS ops and strategy is involved, where product is involved, and where marketing is involved? Because self-serve cuts across all of these, and how does that work at Stripe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is definitely still, I would put like a big work in progress at Stripe. I can tell you right now, most of our, engagement really lives in that high touch space. But when I was, at my prior company, the way it worked, actually, we had for a while, customer marketing actually lived under the chief customer officer. And so kind of what we discussed earlier around that intersection, it was pretty tight because you actually had that team reporting up through the chief customer officer, and they were all targeted with the North Star being net retention. And so there was a lot of focus on that existing customer base. How did you optimize for that? What were the ways you engaged with webinars and different, email campaigns, et cetera? There was also a product forum where all of the leaders sat across like key issues that came, like voice of the customer type stuff. How did that go back to product? And then we created a lot of customer advocacy and also just like roundtables of customers that wanted to sit together, even if they weren't like open to advocating externally, just sitting together and being able to talk about the types of problems they were having in their industry, and then taking all that feedback again back to product and then circulating it back around that circle of folks that I think really bettered the way we engage self-service. We still got a lot of it wrong. Don't get me wrong, we did not solve all the problems, but those are kind of the frameworks that we thought about things in.
I'll just stand up. Your question actually just made me wonder, so we're also still kind of like a growing startup. We're hoping to get to the scale-up level. We're at that place where we're not sure that we want all of our clients to talk to each other yet. Because like we've had some clients who had not awesome experiences and then gotten better, or like we've changed our product over time and things have evolved. So I'm curious, like how do you figure out like what's a safe space to have your clients like talk to each other and not necessarily like just become a potential like negative feedback loop, but actually have it be a productive conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it goes back to the framework that was discussed around customer advocacy. I think that's a really good place to start. We also had certain customers who were okay being referenceable customers like internally. So what we would do is these basic like podcast style calls where we already knew that they were advocates, they had agreed to do it. And then a certain amount of customers that were interested would just dial into this call. We'd kind of do a Q&A podcast type session. And I think that mitigated, we had a lot of control over the questions that were being asked and the type of message and kind of the narrative that we were putting out into the world, but also still bringing that customer in. And it was benefiting a ton of other customers and building connections that way. So maybe the pairing of the advocacy plus maybe something at a smaller scale where you have more control over the narrative that comes out of it might help you guys if you're not ready for like a, hey, let's all sit at a table and just air our grievances kind of conversation. Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you for the informative session here about Stripe. Really enjoyed it.